sexy guys do. Explore what's soul in their minds. Thinking about a thing or two, about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no thinking that would be uncool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by my college friend, Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Boy, it's been quite a couple of weeks, Mark, hasn't it? Been.
Through a minute, yeah. You can't take in one headline until another one hits you square in the face.
Yes, I know. And there's also that headline that I emailed you about the false vacuum decay of our universe that's happening in parallel with the decay of our government. So
yeah, nice to know. Just a little fact in the back of your head that at any moment the entire universe might cease to exist. Hopefully a comfortable collapse rather than an excruciating one, but
right. Yeah. So I'm thinking maybe the faster we get this episode recorded, the better our chance of dropping it before the universe ends.
I know, because people need to know about state lotteries before the end comes. So please, let's get to the point.
Okay, so not to bury the lead, folks, but Mark just said our topic is lotteries. And this one was on my list for quite a while, as I explained last time. But then when I was researching your question about saving, I came across lotteries as one potential explanation for why people save so little. And at first I kind of scoffed at it, like lotteries as opposed to anything else. But then I saw the magnitude of lottery spendings, like it's tens of billions of dollars 10 years ago. And I think it's probably increased significantly since then. And so I dusted off that old question for you. And really, the question comes down to weighing the pros and cons of lotteries and telling us, are they justifiable? So that's the question I put to you. And I'm looking forward to your answer on this one. I have my own opinion on this, but I'm going to try to keep an open mind as I hear what you have to say.
Okay. Well, as always, thank you for the question. Speaking personally, the lottery has never been a big part of my life. I don't think I've ever purchased a lottery ticket for myself, though I did one time receive a lottery ticket as a Christmas gift. There is, however, one memory that always comes to mind when someone mentions the lottery. One year, a long time ago, I was living in a working-class neighborhood in Massachusetts, and on a Friday evening, I stopped by a corner grocer to get some milk. I was only buying that one thing, so I hoped to be in and out in just a few minutes, but it took nearly half an hour to complete my purchase because I was stuck in line behind a string of people who had just cashed their paychecks. One by one, they'd buy lottery tickets and immediately scratch them off by the cash register. And if any of the tickets paid out, $5 or $10, they'd use that money to buy more lottery tickets. So I stood there with my carton of milk, watching them scratch one ticket after another until they finally ran out. It was a little bit surreal, and I remember thinking to myself, what the hell are they doing? Well, hopefully by the end of this episode, we'll have a better idea of what was going on in that moment.
Yeah, and it sounds like you're probably not surprised to hear that stat I gave you last time about the money spent on lotteries based on that story. Just for the record, I've never spent a single dime on a lottery ticket in my entire life either. Though my wife and some friends, they do a jokey group lottery expenditure together, so...
For any of our listeners who do not live in the United States, and we know a few of you are out there, state lotteries are a form of legalized gambling in which you purchase a lottery ticket that gives you a chance at winning a cash prize. Lotteries are today a significant source of revenue for many U.S. states, but they're controversial, with a number of ethical and economic implications that we'll be going over in this episode. Lotteries in some form have existed for centuries. The first recorded lotteries offering tickets for sale with money as prizes were in the 15th century in northwestern Europe and were used to raise funds for town fortifications and to help the poor. Lotteries were a common feature in England from the 16th century onward, and there were lotteries in America almost from the beginning. There were 392 lotteries held in colonial America, and those lotteries were used to finance public work projects such as roads, libraries, churches, canals, bridges, and even the construction of colleges.
Witch burning?
I don't know. I think probably witch burnings were done on the cheap.
Oh, okay.
Princeton, Columbia University, and the University of Pennsylvania were all funded by lotteries in the 1740s and 1750s. Benjamin Franklin organized a lottery to raise money to purchase cannons for the defense of Philadelphia, and the Continental Congress used the lotteries to raise money to support the colonial army during the Revolutionary War.
Interesting.
So I bet you had no idea that the lottery was so much a part of the birth of our great nation.
No, none whatsoever.
At the time, lotteries were viewed as a more palatable way to raise money than explicit taxation. As you know, colonial Americans were very touchy about taxation, particularly taxation without representation, and so they were more open to lotteries because, unlike taxes, lotteries are entirely voluntary. Over time, though, early American lotteries became privatized, and corruption became a real problem. Many lotteries awarded fewer prizes than were advertised, and some didn't bother to award any prizes at all. As the social reform movement picked up steam in the mid-19th century, public opinion turned against gambling, and people began to view lotteries as a way of taking advantage of the poor. Beginning in the Northeast, states started banning lotteries, and by 1860 most states had outlawed the practice. After a brief resurgence in lotteries after the Civil War, especially in the South, where lotteries were used to fund Reconstruction, further examples of lottery corruption led to a federal ban on the interstate sale of lottery tickets in 1895.
Interesting. Can I just jump in there? Because that seems so counterintuitive to me that I would have guessed that the history of lotteries would begin with them being banned by the Puritans and then gradually relax and lotteries being implemented in the 19th century. But it's exactly the opposite.
I don't know exactly, but I join you in the belief that Puritans would have been against lotteries because Puritans were generally against just about everything except sitting in church and reading the Bible. But in periods of colonial America where the Puritan influence was not so strong, it became just an easier way to raise money than to get people to agree to a new tax. So, lotteries are banned by the same wave of public sentiment that eventually led to Prohibition. And when Prohibition was repealed in 1933, almost immediately lotteries started to make a comeback. The first government-run lottery after the federal ban was held in Puerto Rico in 1934. Since this lottery didn't sell tickets across state lines, it was legal under the law. Public surveys in the subsequent decade showed that more people approved of lotteries than disapproved, and in 1964, New Hampshire was the first U.S. state to re-legalize the lottery. The 1960s overall were the period when state lotteries and casinos re-emerged as a means of raising government revenue without raising taxes.
Well, that kind of fits, right? Because if the lottery is based in this anti-vice sentiment that also led to temperance and stuff like that, the 60s were a period when those old shibboleths were challenged. So it kind of makes sense that they'd come back in the 60s.
Yeah, absolutely. Free love and lottery tickets.
Right. And if you have both, you were really living.
Indeed. As of 2024, 45 states plus the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands participate in state-run lottery programs. They're required by law to operate under the control of the state legislature, and nearly all of the proceeds go back to the state. But generally things like advertising and administration are handled by private entities. So Joe, quick quiz. Do you think you can name any of the 5 states that do not currently have lotteries?
Sometimes we are so simpatico, Mark, because I was going to ask you which 5 states don't have the lottery. So let me try to guess. I'm going to guess that it's disproportionately in the South because whatever prurience still exists, is probably there. So Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. I'm guessing the Mormons probably don't approve of lottery, so I'm going to throw Utah in there. And let's see, I need a 5th one. I'll say Texas because they're backwards in everything.
Well, you went 2 for 5 on that. You were correct in Alabama and Utah. Alabama in the South is just sort of the outlier. I didn't find a clear stance why they don't have one. In Utah, it's because of widespread religious opposition to gambling. The Mormon Church is not big on that sort of thing. The other 3 states are surprisingly in the West: Alaska, Hawaii, and Nevada. And in the case of Alaska, they do actually have charitable lotteries, just not a state lottery. So, for instance, there's a lottery in Alaska that supports a zoo, and there are lotteries in Alaska that support Native American causes. Meanwhile, Hawaii prohibits most form of gambling due to concerns about crime and the negative impact on poor communities. And then in Nevada, this is my favorite case.
Yeah.
It's simply the case that the casinos do not want competition from lotteries.
So I'm thinking Nevada makes no sense, right? With the home of Las Vegas and Reno, the home of quickie divorces. Like, that's vice capital of the United States.
Yes, but politically entrenched vice, which is trying to keep other forms of vice out of the state.
That makes sense, I guess.
So for the states that do have lotteries, they account for, on average, about 2% of overall state revenues. Lotteries in 2022 brought in nearly $98 billion in sales and paid out just over $65 billion in prizes. So if you were to spend $100 on lottery tickets, you can expect to get back about $65 in prize money. After prize payouts and administrative costs, about 29% of lottery proceeds go back to the states as revenue. In 2022, 4 states, New York, California, Florida, and Texas, raked in more than $8 billion from lottery sales.
Now, that seems to me really inefficient, but not surprising, right? If you consider just the advertising of lotteries is so ubiquitous, they must spend tons of money advertising lotteries at the state level, and that's probably where a lot of that 35% goes.
Right. 50% of Americans buy at least one lottery ticket per year, though most are not regular players. Instead, they buy a ticket when the jackpot starts getting really high. Americans spend an average of $390 per capita on lottery tickets, though, and most lottery tickets cost just $2 or $3, which tells you how many tickets are being purchased. And the primary reason for all those tickets being purchased is lotteries today can have huge payouts. You'll remember that I mentioned a federal ban on interstate lottery sales, but modern lotteries have found a loophole that's resulted in enormous jackpots. Powerball and Mega Millions are multi-state lotteries, and they're able to stay on the right side of the law by acting as umbrella organizations for individual state lotteries, each of which sells tickets within its jurisdiction. But the revenues are pooled to fund the prizes. In 2022, there was a $2 billion Powerball jackpot, which was the largest in history. And lots of people will buy a lottery ticket for the chance of being a billionaire. Of course, the odds when you play for these big prizes are astronomically stacked against you. The odds of winning the Mega Millions or Powerball jackpots are both about 1 in 300 million. By comparison, the odds of being struck by lightning in a given year are about 1 in 1.2 million. The odds of it being attacked by a shark are 1 in 3.7 million. The odds of being killed by an asteroid, according to NASA estimates, are about 1 in 74 million. The odds of dying by being crushed by a vending machine are 1 in 110 million, still 3 times more likely than winning the lottery. And the odds of flipping a coin and getting heads 28 times in a row is about 1 in 268 million. So the next time you're thinking about buying a Powerball ticket, maybe first flip a coin, try to get heads 28 times in a row, and then reflect on the fact that winning the lottery is actually a little bit more difficult than that.
And this begs the next question, right? And if maybe you're going to discuss this, so why are people doing it? Are they unaware of those odds? You know, what explains this seemingly irrational behavior?
Well, we'll be getting to that, so stay tuned. The arguments in favor of state lotteries begin, of course, with the fact that it's an easy way to raise money. That was the argument for lotteries back in the 15th century, and it remains the argument today. It's much easier to raise money through lotteries than it is to raise taxes. Many states earmark lottery proceeds for specific programs, most commonly education, and on the surface it's an easy sell. No one is forced to buy lottery tickets. You only participate if you want to. And who's against the idea of raising money for school kids? In fact, lotteries have proven to be a fairly reliable source of revenue for states. In addition to education, lottery proceeds often are earmarked for feel-good ends such as parks and recreation, senior citizens programs, and police and firefighter pensions. Other arguments in favor of lotteries are that they provide entertainment at a relatively low cost, and that by providing revenue for retail locations, lottery operators, and other service providers, they create jobs and benefit the economy. There are, however, weak points in all of these arguments. First of all, on the entertainment value of lotteries, while there may be an initial thrill of excitement when you buy the ticket and imagine winning big, it's worth asking how entertaining is the full experience when time after time you end up losing. I told you that story about the time I was stuck in a line behind those people playing the lottery on payday, and I can't say that I remember them looking like they were really having a lot of fun in that moment. Quite the opposite, they kind of seemed depressed. Since lotteries are voluntary, revenue from lottery sales can fluctuate significantly, which makes it difficult to base any plans on expected lottery revenue. And even when the lottery funds aren't earmarked for specific programs, such as public education, that doesn't necessarily mean that those programs receive any more funding than they would have otherwise. Instead, lottery proceeds simply replace tax revenue in these areas and allow lawmakers to shift funding to other pet projects. The economic benefit of lotteries are also questionable. Lotteries tend to be especially popular among the poor. People with lower incomes tend to spend a larger percentage of their income on lottery tickets, and studies have shown that those in the lowest fifth in terms of socioeconomic status have the highest rate of lottery participation. Lottery spending also decreases as income rises, and since poor people have less discretionary wealth to spend, every dollar they spend at the lottery may, within a zero-sum game, result in one less dollar spent on food or other retail goods, meaning that some percentage of lottery spending is not added to the economy, it is simply redistributed from one part of the economy to the other.
Right, not to mention which it's the most regressive tax you can possibly think of.
Yeah, exactly that, yeah.
If the least able are the ones who spend the most.
Yeah, the charge that lotteries are a highly regressive hidden tax on the poor is a commonly brought charge against the practice. For instance, when lottery revenue is earmarked for education funding, but it's distributed to all school districts equally, you could argue that, in effect, lower-income neighborhoods are partially funding education in more well-off communities. Most tellingly, the lottery industry knows where their bread is buttered. Studies have found that stores that sell lottery tickets are disproportionately located in lower-income communities. Black and Hispanic Americans spend more on lottery tickets than other demographic groups, so there's a predatory behavior behind the sale of lottery tickets that's enabled by the fact that lotteries are exempt from FTC truth in advertising laws. They are not legally obligated to disclose the actual odds of winning or the average losses incurred by players. Instead, lotteries commonly release ads suggesting that everyone can win, even though, of course, almost nobody does, and these deceptive practices are overseen by the very same states that rely on revenue from those lotteries, which creates a clear conflict of interest.
You have to be in it to win it, not.
Yeah, indeed.
With minds like steel traps, more than joy here to discern. The interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. And it's a calling and they do it for you. Explain me, baby. Explain it. It's appalling that you don't do it too.
Lotteries are also criticized on the grounds that they promote the idea that the pathway out of poverty is paved with good luck rather than hard work. Now, I know this critique is well-intentioned, but it makes me a little uncomfortable. It strikes me as paternalistic and condescending. A lot of the literature on state lotteries presents lower-income lottery participants as victims of the lottery industry, deceived by deceptive advertising, and fundamentally incapable of understanding the laws of probability. My sense, though, is that poor people might possibly understand their lives and their prospects as well or better than we do. I believe that they're making decisions that make some degree of sense within the context of their circumstances. So with that in mind, I'd like to consider alternatives. Why would you play the lottery if that money would probably be spent on something else, and you also know that you're almost certainly not going to win? Studies suggest that, first off, you play because it makes you feel good. Lottery players often experience a surge in positive emotions after purchasing the ticket, and some part of these emotions persist regardless of whether or not the ticket wins. In a way, then, a lottery ticket is kind of like a glass of wine or a beer. It's a relatively low-cost way of giving yourself a boost that, though temporary, still feels good in the moment.
Or if I could compare it to something that I have done, I have bought raffle tickets, which I guess is another form of the lottery. And I can attest to what you just said, that it's kind of a little bit exciting to have a raffle ticket as you're waiting to see who the winner is, right? And even if you lose, there's still a residual buzz of excitement. So maybe I should have modified my earlier statement that I don't play the lottery because I have purchased raffle tickets.
Thank you for bringing that up. I hadn't thought of that. I also have occasionally purchased a raffle ticket, and it occurs to me that raffle tickets might be like an underground black market form of lottery that's not regulated by state legislation. Right. It's the speakeasy of the lottery world.
Right.
Studies of gambling have also suggested that there's a near-miss effect. The act of playing triggers a dopamine release in the brain, even when you lose. This might explain why scratch-off tickets, which account for 2/3 of lottery spending, are so popular, since people get the excitement of uncovering numbers and feeling like they almost won. Another study found that people often derive social benefit from discussing what they would do if they did win the lottery. And this payoff, the feeling of connection with friends and family, does not depend on actually winning. Ultimately, though, playing the lottery might simply be a form of escape. If you're under financial stress and have a lottery ticket in your hand, for just a moment you can imagine that all your problems are over. If life has you feeling trapped, the lottery offers you a way out. And if your daily reality includes a feeling of hopelessness, even the very small hope of winning the lottery might feel like the best part of your day. And that feels about right to me. The lottery, I would argue, is clearly a regressive tax that serves to extract money from poor communities. And its greatest benefit, I'd argue, is that it offers a tiny spark of hope to those who are otherwise hopeless. The world can feel cold and indifferent to our struggles. Every day, people turn to alcohol, drugs, and sugary foods to make them feel just a little bit better, if only for a little while. That's what the lottery does too, and it doesn't make you fat or cause cancer. America promises hope to all its citizens, but historically we have struggled to deliver on that promise. I can empathize with the need to feel hopeful, even for just a moment. I don't personally buy lottery tickets, but I feel like, after all these years, I do understand those people in front of me in line at that corner market. They are buying hope, one ticket at a time, and who knows, maybe it helped.
Yeah, I mean, what you say at the end really resonates for me, the need to feel hope. I mean, you and I just recently did a podcast episode about reasons for hope precisely because of our need to feel hope in these uncertain times. So I think it's absolutely correct of you to ascribe that to lottery ticket buyers as well. And the other point you made at the end about desperation, I would say the desperation to escape poverty, to be more specific maybe, is what makes poor people disproportionately susceptible to lotteries, or disproportionately likely to buy tickets, if you want to say it that way. So I completely agree with those points. There are a couple of arguments, though, that I didn't hear you make. I want to just ask you about before we sign off on this topic. One is in the same realm of condescending arguments about poor people. I have heard that one of the arguments for lotteries is that poor people's money is better off going to the state to fund education than it is going to alcohol or nicotine or other drugs, to feed their desperation, to satiate their desperation. So
that's harsh.
Yeah.
I have to say, that's pretty harsh. First off, because as we've noted here, often the lottery funds do not increase education funding. They just replace education funding that would otherwise be coming from tax revenues. So it's not that we're extracting money, vice money from the poor and creating a social good out of it. We're just extracting the money.
Yeah.
And I called out that other argument about how poor people don't understand the odds as being paternalistic and condescending. The argument you just floated there seems like the harsher, the more paternalistic, the more condescending version of that we not only need to protect the poor from their own ignorance, but we should actually take away their money because we expect them to spend it poorly. That I find to be, just straight up offensive.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'm not endorsing that argument. I'm just saying that over the years, when I encounter arguments about the lottery, I've heard that one as an argument in favor of the lottery. When it comes to arguments against the lottery, there's one I really didn't hear you articulate clearly, though you kind of talked around it. And that is what I would call the moral argument. Should the government be in the business of actively promoting gambling?
Yeah, it's definitely been in the air. That was originally the argument in the late 19th century for outlawing lotteries entirely.
Right.
I'm not sure where I fall on that because there's no way that the lottery is the only way in which institutions and governments are promoting gambling. Like you and I were both consumers of sports, and it's really struck me how prevalent it is, that gambling has just become intrinsic to sports media, where you have a call about, upcoming raft of games, and then a section within the column is advice on how you should bet on those games. There's an acceptance of gambling in our society today that seems like it would have been impossible 20 years ago. So I do find that distasteful. And I do feel like probably, yes, our government should not be in the business of gambling. But with riverboat casinos and that sort of thing, they already are. So I'm less likely to single out lotteries as an example of that. I would say it's a good example of a more broad-based thing, which I'm uncomfortable with, but which it just seems like the wave of popular opinion is going in the opposite direction. People love their gambling. And it seems like we as a society, the many questionable decisions Americans have made recently on a national basis, that would seem to be part of it, is that we love to gamble.
Yeah.
And I do think that it generally has deleterious effects on the personal and societal level. So I'd be sympathetic to that, but I'd not call it lotteries specifically as the wrongdoers. In that case, it's just one example of many.
Yeah, I guess I agree that it seems like the government has thrown in the towel or thrown up its hands, right, about gambling in general. And what you say is true. Sports gambling is another item that's on my list of things to ask you about. I strongly suspect there will be a future episode about sports gambling in particular because of it. What I'm interested in that subject is its effect on the purity of the sport, Yeah. But yeah, that's a very good illustration of how ubiquitous gambling has become, how entwined it is in the culture, that sports gambling is so big and so quickly too, for crying out loud. Like, I think it's been around less than 10 years and it's like everywhere now.
And there is an interesting conversation to be had where I believe intelligent people could disagree on the extent to which the government should be in the business of making moral calls on behalf of its citizens. Because that includes things like alcohol. It used to be that the government said that it's wrong to drink and that it's intrinsically immoral, and that leads to moral turpitude, and therefore it's illegal. And then the nation later decided, actually, no, individuals should decide whether they drink. And so I could see a reasonable person arguing that it's basically the same with gambling. It's not the government's place to tell you whether to gamble. That's a choice that you make within your own life and in the context of your own needs and motivations and responsibilities. I could understand that point of view, and I'm not sure that if I had to go into a ballot box and cast my vote, if I would vote that line, but I could understand that perspective.
Yeah, and that reflects larger cultural trends, I think. So similarly, the government's position vis-a-vis marijuana has moved in that direction as well. We're not going to police what you do in your own privacy. And even though these aren't substances, these are behaviors, but gay marriage and trans rights, it's the same overall trajectory of gradually, fitfully moving toward more permissiveness, more do your own thing type of attitude.
Yeah. And the campaigns against moral turpitude historically have been led by middle-class people trying to shut down practices that were common among the poor. So there's also a class element to that, and sort of a way of looking down on the things that poor people engage in, with the thought that they're weaker, they're less educated, they're more naive, and we need to teach them better, that sort of thing. A sort of paternalistic attitude. And I think my perspective on that, which I hinted at in the script for this episode, is that there's a reason why poor people drink more. There's a reason why poor people buy lottery tickets. And it's not because they're weak. It's because they are in a situation that would feel hopeless and intolerable. And these things help you get through hard days. Maybe not the best way, but speaking as someone who made himself feel better by buying a donut rather than going out to the health club, I can relate to short-term decisions that do feel good in the moment and maybe don't pay off in the long run. I'm not pretending to be superior in any way to that way of doing things.
Right. I'm glad you said that, because that's really the last thing I wanted to ask you about. Is you presented arguments for and against, and then your interesting take on what you think is really going on, the role that lotteries are actually playing. But I wasn't sure I heard an answer to my question of, on balance, are lotteries justifiable? So what you just said a minute ago suggests to me that your position is, yes, they are justifiable because of that need to have hope. And this is a way to give yourself some hope.
It's a complicated question. I think my answer would be, on a societal level, there's no justification. On an individual level, there's justification. The individual can justify their choice to buy the lottery ticket. It is questionable whether the state can legitimately justify its reason to issue lottery tickets. That would probably be my final answer. But I think probably if a state were to eliminate a lottery, you would just be taking that need for a short-term hope boost and that little dopamine hit, and it would just transfer somewhere else. It would go to cigarette sales or to alcohol or to vape pens. As long as you're not reducing social misery, when you take away outlets, you're not solving the problem. You're just pushing the impulse to a different part of the person's life.
Right. Okay, fair enough. I like that answer. And I think I agree with a lot of what you said.
Okay, cool. So does that mean you're ready for the question for next time?
I am, yes.
Right. So lately, I've been hearing a lot about GLP-1 drugs. The most popular brand name of that is Ozempic. Originally, these drugs were approved by the FDA as a treatment for diabetes, but subsequently, they've shown to have dramatic effects on weight loss, addiction, and a whole host of other conditions. Just as I was getting ready to join this podcast recording session, I saw a headline that GLP-1 drugs have been shown to increase libido, so it even has an effect within sex drive. I heard a podcast recently that argued without irony that these drugs are on par with the discovery of penicillin in terms of the beneficial impacts they might have. But despite their positive effects, some authorities have expressed concern about the use of these drugs. So I'd like you to look into the pluses and minuses of GLP-1 drug use and let me know. Do you think this is a medical breakthrough that will have a profound effect on obesity, addictive cravings, and other serious and stubborn health issues? Or are GLP-1 drugs simply too good to be true?
Well, that's an interesting and timely topic. I'm certainly aware of Ozempic and aware of the great pop song by Pilot, Magic, that is used in those Ozempic commercials. Maybe we'll play a little of that next time. But I didn't know that acronym. What is that? What are those letters? What is it?
GLP-1. And do not ask me what GLP stands for because I could not tell you. I believe it refers to some structure within the brain.
Okay. Well, I'll answer on that next time, but I had not heard that acronym. But yeah, good topic. Good question. I will go and research that and come back to you in a couple of weeks. And that's when you will next hear the Mansplaining podcast. In the meantime, though, folks, if you haven't checked out our new Spotify page where all the great music you've been hearing for months, including our theme song, is available on Spotify. So please do check it out.
Yeah. And if you happen to have discovered this podcast through Spotify or our music on one of the other services, I would be fascinated to hear about that. So please stop by our Facebook page or give us a call at our voicemail number and let us know.
Yes. But in the meantime, that was Mark and I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you then.
But a crapshoot, a tax on your stupidity.
No, sir, your point is moot. It has no validity.
Let's face it, we just can't agree about the lottery.
It's nothing but a fool's game, a simple bait and switch.
Maybe so, but all the same, it's gonna make me rich. Let's face it, we just can't agree about the lottery. Spend an awful lot of money with little chance to win it.
But in the land of milk and honey,
don't I have to be in it? Let's face it, we just can't agree about the lottery. The odds are so low,
you'd sooner get hit.
hit by lightning,
But I've got that eager glow.
and my life needs some brightening. Let's face it, we just can't agree about the
Lottery.
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.
best way is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain it. There can be no faking, that would be uncool.
Attention mansplaining listeners. If you want to engage with Mark and me, you have some options. One is to go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, where you can leave a comment or question, check our sources, suggest topics for future episodes, or just like us, because who doesn't want to be liked? You can also reach us through whatever app you use to listen to this podcast by giving us a 5-star rating or writing a review of your favorite episode. Or you can call and leave us a message on our dedicated voicemail box, which is 206-486-4074. It's lonely in podcast land, and we welcome and appreciate any feedback you might want to share. Act now, and we'll throw in a set of Ginsu knives. Not really.